The delivery driver wouldn't look me in the eye when he handed me the package. He kept glancing at his truck like he couldn't wait to get away from my house. I should have trusted that instinct. "Sign here, ma'am. Happy Mother's Day." But there was nothing happy about what was waiting for me inside that innocent-looking brown box. As I carried it into my kitchen, I noticed my hands were trembling, though I couldn't understand why. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. When I set it down on my counter, I heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in any Mother's Day gift, a sound that made every survival instinct in my body scream at me to run. But I didn't run. Instead, I did something that saved my life. I listened to that voice in my head telling me not to trust what I was seeing. Because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones planning to hurt you the worst. My name is Maria Elena Vasquez, and I'm about to tell you how a simple family argument about money almost cost me everything, including my life. I'll never forget the moment I realized my own daughter had sent me something that could have killed me. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the package on my kitchen counter, hearing that unmistakable sound coming from inside the cardboard box, a soft, menacing hiss that made my blood run cold. 911, what's your emergency? I need help. There's something alive in this package, and I think it's dangerous. The breathing holes punched into the sides weren't accidents. They were carefully planned. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to stay alive long enough to terrify me. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, waiting for police to arrive, one horrible thought kept racing through my mind. Only 3 people knew I'd be home alone that Mother's Day morning. Only 3 people had my exact address and knew my Sunday routine. And only one of them had recently screamed at me that I'd regret choosing money over family. My name is Maria Elena Vasquez, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your DNA. I'll never forget that Mother's Day morning when I almost lost everything because of a package I almost opened without thinking. My name is Maria Elena Vasquez, and at 54, I thought I'd seen every kind of family crisis imaginable. After 28 years working as a school administrator in Phoenix, dealing with troubled teenagers and their complicated family situations, I believed nothing could shock me anymore. I was wrong. It was May 12th, 2024, and the Arizona sun was already heating up my small front porch when the delivery truck pulled into my driveway. The driver seemed unusually nervous as he handed me a medium-sized box wrapped in brown shipping paper. No return address, just my name written in block letters that looked vaguely familiar, but somehow felt wrong. "Special delivery for Mother's Day," he said, though something in his voice suggested he wanted to get away from my house as quickly as possible. I signed for the package, noticing how light it felt for its size, maybe 3 pounds at most. The box had small holes punched along the sides, tiny perforations that I initially mistook for damage from rough handling. I carried it into my kitchen, setting it on the counter next to the coffee maker where morning sunlight streamed through my window. The house felt unusually quiet. My neighbor Rosa was probably at church with her family, and the street held that peaceful Sunday stillness that I'd grown to treasure since retiring from the chaos of middle school administration. But something about this package felt different. Wrong somehow. The holes weren't random damage. They were too precise, too purposeful. As I examined them more closely, a terrible understanding began to form in my mind. These weren't shipping accidents. They were breathing holes. My hands started shaking as I backed away from the counter. In my 30 years of living in this house, raising my daughter Sophia here, I'd never received anything that required air circulation. Nothing alive had ever been delivered to my doorstep, especially not anonymously, especially not on Mother's Day. The box made a soft rustling sound. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911, my voice barely steady as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. "I have a suspicious package with something alive inside," I whispered, never taking my eyes off the innocent-looking brown cardboard that suddenly felt like a bomb waiting to explode. "Ma'am, please move to another room and wait for officers to arrive," the dispatcher instructed. "Do not touch or attempt to open the package under any circumstances." But even as I backed out of my kitchen, one terrible thought kept racing through my mind. Only 3 people knew I'd be home alone this Mother's Day. Only 3 people had my exact address and would know my Sunday morning routine. And only one of them had recently screamed at me that I'd regret choosing money over family. Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from today. To understand how that package ended up on my doorstep, I need to take you back 3 weeks earlier to the argument that changed everything between my daughter Sophia and me. It was a conversation I'd been dreading for months, but could no longer avoid. I was born in Tucson to parents who had immigrated from Sonora, Mexico, with nothing but determination and faith. My father worked construction, while my mother cleaned houses, both of them sacrificing everything so their children could have opportunities they'd never had. Education was sacred in our family. My parents didn't speak perfect English, but they made sure I understood that knowledge was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. That belief shaped my entire life. I earned my bachelor's degree in education, then my master's in administration, working my way up from classroom teacher to assistant principal to finally running one of Phoenix's most challenging middle schools. For 28 years, I watched troubled kids transform their lives through education and hard work. I believed deeply that with the right support and clear boundaries, anyone could overcome their circumstances. That philosophy worked beautifully with other people's children. With my own daughter, it became my greatest failure. Sophia had been such a bright little girl, curious about everything, always asking questions that made me proud of her quick mind. But somewhere during her teenage years, something shifted. The girl who used to help me grade papers and organize school events became someone I barely recognized. She discovered that tears and manipulation could often get her what hard work couldn't. I enabled it. I see that now with painful clarity. Every time Sophia claimed an emergency, I wrote a check. When she needed money for college textbooks, I paid without asking for receipts. When she said her car needed repairs, I transferred funds immediately. When she moved in with Jake, her boyfriend, who seemed to have no job, but plenty of opinions about what other people owed him, I convinced myself that love meant financial support. For 8 years, I'd been Sophia's personal bank. Monthly rent payments that started as temporary help became permanent obligations. Credit card bills that were supposed to be one-time emergencies became regular expectations. Insurance payments, car repairs, grocery money, utilities. Every aspect of adult life that she should have been handling herself somehow became my responsibility. The breaking point came 3 weeks before that Mother's Day package arrived. Sophia had called me sobbing about gambling debts that Jake had accumulated at some online casino. $15,000. Money they didn't have, money they needed immediately, money that somehow became my problem to solve. I'd been sitting in my home office looking at my retirement statements, calculating how many more years I could afford to fund Sophia's crises. At 54, I should have been planning travels and hobbies, not figuring out how to stretch my pension to cover 2 households. That's when I finally said the word I should have learned 31 years earlier when Sophia was born. No. The word felt foreign in my mouth when I said it to Sophia that afternoon. No, mija, I can't give you $15,000 for Jake's gambling debts. The silence on the phone stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then Sophia's voice came back, but it wasn't the voice of the daughter I'd raised. It was cold, calculating, and filled with a rage that made my stomach turn. What do you mean? No, Mom, we're family. Family helps family. You have the money just sitting there doing nothing while Jake and I are drowning. I looked around my modest home office, at the second-hand desk I'd bought when I became an administrator, at the carefully organized files containing my retirement planning. Nothing about my life suggested wealth. Yet somehow, Sophia had convinced herself that I was hoarding riches while deliberately watching her suffer. Sophia, I worked for 28 years to save that money. It's not just sitting there doing nothing. It's my security for the future. Your security? Her laugh was harsh and bitter. Mom, you're 54 years old. What future are you planning for? You could live comfortably on half of what you have saved. The rest is just selfishness. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Selfish. This from the woman whose rent I'd been paying for 3 years, whose car insurance came out of my account every month, whose emergency credit card was linked to my bank account. Sophia, I've given you over $40,000 in the past 3 years alone. Money for rent, car payments, credit cards, groceries, utilities. When does it end? When does it end? She repeated, her voice rising to a pitch that reminded me of the tantrums she'd thrown as a toddler. It ends when you stop treating money like it's more important than your own daughter's happiness. But I wasn't buying her happiness anymore. I was funding her destruction, enabling Jake's gambling addiction, and teaching my 7-year-old grandson, Miguel, that love could be purchased with grandmother's credit card. No, I said again, and this time the word felt stronger. I won't give you money for gambling debts. I won't continue paying your rent. I won't keep enabling choices that are destroying your life. The explosion of fury that followed was unlike anything I'd heard from Sophia since her teenage years. She screamed about my selfishness, my coldness, my failure as a mother. She accused me of caring more about money than family, of abandoning her when she needed me most, of being exactly like the wealthy white families whose children I dealt with at school, privileged and heartless. The conversation ended with Sophia sobbing that I'd regret this decision, that I was destroying our family, that I wouldn't see Miguel anymore if I insisted on being so cruel. I hung up feeling shaken, but oddly relieved. For the first time in years, I'd stood up to my daughter's manipulation. I had no idea she was planning her revenge. 3 days after that phone call, Sophia showed up at my house with Jake and little Miguel. I watched from my front window as they got out of their car. Sophia's face set in the determined expression she'd worn since childhood, when she wanted something badly enough to fight for it. Miguel ran ahead to my front door, his 7-year-old energy a bright spot in what I already knew would be a difficult conversation. When I opened the door, he threw his arms around my waist with the pure affection that made everything else worth bearing. Abuela Maria, I missed you, he said, in the mix of English and Spanish that delighted me. This child was the joy of my life, the reason I'd enabled Sophia's behavior for so long. The fear of losing access to Miguel had kept me writing checks long after common sense told me to stop. Sophia pushed past us into my living room, Jake following with the swagger of someone who felt entitled to enter my home and make demands. I'd never liked Jake even before I understood his gambling problem. There was something about his assumption that other people's resources were his to claim that reminded me of the most difficult parents I'd dealt with during my years in education. Mom, we need to finish our conversation from the other day, Sophia announced, settling onto my couch as if she owned it. Miguel, go play in the backyard while the adults talk. I kissed my grandson's forehead and watched him run toward the back door, his innocent presence the only thing keeping my anger in check. Once he was outside, Sophia's mask dropped completely. $15,000, Mom. That's all we need to get back on our feet. Jake's learned his lesson about the gambling, haven't you, baby? Jake nodded with the practiced sincerity of someone who'd made similar promises before. It was just a rough patch, Maria. Sometimes a man needs to take risks to provide for his family. But I'm done with all that now. I looked at this man who'd never held a steady job in the 3 years he'd been with my daughter, who somehow felt qualified to lecture me about providing for family while living off my financial support. Jake, you've been taking risks with money that isn't yours. My money. Money I earned through decades of work while you've been unemployed. His face darkened. That's your daughter's money too. Sophia's your only child. Everything you have should be hers eventually anyway. Why not help us out now when we actually need it? The entitlement was breathtaking. In Jake's mind, my life savings belonged to him and Sophia, simply because they wanted it. My years of careful planning, my sacrifices to build financial security, my right to control my own resources, none of that mattered against their immediate desires. Because it's not yours, I said quietly. It's mine. I earned it, I saved it, and I decide how it's used. That's when Sophia stood up and threw my coffee mug against the wall. When Sophia threw my ceramic mug against the kitchen wall, watching it shatter into pieces across my tile floor, I knew our relationship had crossed a line we couldn't return from. The sound of breaking pottery mixed with her screaming about my selfishness and Jake's angry muttering about ungrateful mothers who hoard their wealth. I stood there in my own home, watching my daughter rage like a child having a tantrum, while her boyfriend nodded approval at her destructive behavior. Miguel's worried face appeared at the back door, drawn by the shouting, and I realized this little boy was witnessing his mother destroy property because his grandmother wouldn't hand over money for gambling debts. That image, my grandson's confused and frightened expression, crystallized everything wrong with the situation I'd enabled for years. Sophia wasn't just manipulating me anymore. She was teaching Miguel that violence and intimidation were acceptable tools for getting what you wanted from family members. Jake stepped closer to where I stood, his bulk intended to intimidate me in my own living room. He began explaining that I wasn't getting any younger, that hoarding money while family members struggled was selfish, that sharing wealth while alive to see it appreciated showed real love. His tone carried the practiced manipulation of someone who'd perfected the art of making his problems everyone else's responsibility. I listened to him lecture me about family obligations while thinking about the months of his unemployment, the credit card bills I'd paid, the rent money that had come out of my retirement savings. This man who contributed nothing to society felt qualified to tell me how to manage resources I'd spent 3 decades earning. Sophia joined his lecture, her voice rising as she accused me of caring more about money than my own daughter's well-being. She painted herself as a victim of my greed, conveniently forgetting the years of financial support that had enabled her current lifestyle. According to her twisted logic, I was abandoning family by refusing to fund Jake's gambling addiction. The conversation spiraled into threats about Miguel. Sophia made it clear that my relationship with my grandson depended entirely on my willingness to continue financial support. No money meant no access to the child who brought light into my retirement years. She'd weaponized my love for Miguel, turning it into a tool for extracting money from my accounts. I finally told them both to leave my house. Sophia's response was to promise that I'd regret choosing money over family, that when I was old and sick, I'd remember this moment when I needed their care. Jake added his own threats about family loyalty and consequences for abandoning relatives in crisis. They left with dramatic door slamming and tire squealing, taking Miguel with them before I could say goodbye. I stood in my quiet kitchen, looking at ceramic pieces scattered across the floor, understanding that my daughter had just declared war on my financial independence. What I didn't understand was how far she was willing to take that war. That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by bank statements, credit card bills, and financial documents that told the story of 8 years of enabling my daughter's irresponsibility. Every monthly transfer to cover Sophia's rent, every emergency payment for Jake's mistakes, every crisis that had somehow become my obligation to solve. The paper trail was devastating. $43,000 over 3 years. Money that should have been earning interest in my retirement accounts, instead flowing to support 2 adults who refused to manage their own finances. I'd been so focused on helping Sophia that I'd never calculated the true cost of my generosity. My computer screen glowed as I logged into online banking, reviewing the automatic payments that had become as routine as my morning coffee. Monthly rent transfers, car insurance premiums, a credit card that Sophia used for emergencies that occurred with suspicious regularity. 8 years of financial entanglement that had started with temporary help and evolved into permanent dependency. I thought about my parents who had worked multiple jobs to support our family without ever asking for handouts from relatives. They'd taught me that dignity came from earning your way, that accepting help should be temporary and accompanied by gratitude. Sophia had learned the opposite lesson, that family resources existed for her convenience, regardless of the cost to others. The cursor hovered over the account management page as I wrestled with 8 years of maternal guilt. Was I abandoning my daughter, or was I finally teaching her the lesson about personal responsibility that I should have enforced years earlier? I began typing. First, I removed Sophia as an authorized user on my credit card account, the same card that showed charges to pet stores and reptile suppliers from recent weeks. Charges I'd noticed, but dismissed as purchases. For Miguel, never imagining they were tools for revenge. Next came the automatic transfers. Monthly rent payments that had started as temporary assistance during Sophia's unemployment had become permanent obligations lasting years beyond any reasonable help. I canceled each recurring payment, watching 8 years of financial enabling disappear with methodical clicking. The car insurance proved more complicated because it was bundled with my own policy. I called the company and arranged for Sophia's vehicle to be removed from my coverage, effective immediately. Tomorrow morning, she would discover that her safety net had vanished. Finally, I changed every PIN and password that Sophia had learned through years of managing my accounts during supposed emergencies. New numbers, new security questions, new barriers between my retirement savings and her manufactured crises. The process took 2 hours, but felt like the work of minutes. 8 years of financial entanglement undone in one evening of decisive action. When I finished, Sophia would have no access to my resources, no ability to create emergencies that required my immediate financial response, no leverage over my retirement security. I leaned back in my desk chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring Sophia's angry discovery that her personal bank had permanently closed. I had no idea she was already planning her Mother's Day surprise. Sophia's phone call came at 7:30 the next morning, catching me in my kitchen with coffee and the newspaper, enjoying the first peaceful morning I'd had in months, without worrying about potential financial emergencies. Her voice carried the panic of someone whose safety net had suddenly disappeared. Her credit card had been declined at the grocery store. The automatic payment for her car insurance had bounced. Her rent scheduled to transfer from my account that morning hadn't gone through. She wanted to know what technical problem was affecting my banking system. I told her there was no technical problem. I had deliberately removed her access to my financial accounts after years of watching my retirement savings drain away to fund her irresponsible choices. The woman who had thrown ceramic mugs in my kitchen now faced the consequences of depending entirely on someone else's money. Her response escalated quickly, from confusion to fury to desperate pleading. She accused me of sabotaging her family's security, of choosing money over maternal love, of abandoning my daughter and grandson during their time of greatest need. According to Sophia, cutting off financial support after 8 years of constant assistance was an act of unforgivable cruelty. I listened to her threats about limiting my access to Miguel, her promises that I would regret this decision when I needed her care in my old age, her accusations that I was exactly like the cold, wealthy parents whose children had caused problems at my school. She painted me as a heartless woman who valued bank balances more than family relationships. When I hung up, I felt the strange combination of relief and sadness that comes with finally setting boundaries after years of being manipulated. Relief that Sophia's financial crises would no longer be my responsibility. Sadness that my daughter had become someone who measured love entirely in dollars, transferred to her checking account. The second call came 3 hours later. Sophia had calmed down enough to try a different approach, switching from anger to victimization. She explained that Jake was working hard to find employment, that Miguel needed new school clothes, that unexpected expenses always seemed to arise just when they were getting back on their feet. I recognized the manipulation techniques because I'd seen them countless times in parent conferences during my years as an administrator. The shift from aggression to sympathy seeking, the emphasis on children's needs, the suggestion that previous support created ongoing obligations. Sophia had learned to use every tool available to extract money from the adults in her life. But I was no longer the enabling mother who wrote checks to avoid confrontation. I was a woman who had spent 3 decades dealing with manipulative behavior in professional settings, and I finally understood that my daughter was using the same tactics that troubled students employed when they wanted to avoid consequences for their choices. The conversation ended with Sophia promising that our relationship would never recover from my selfishness. Looking back, I realized that was the moment she decided to send me something that would ensure she was right. That brings us back to Mother's Day morning, standing in my kitchen with a package that contained something alive and potentially dangerous. The police arrived within 12 minutes of my call, followed quickly by an animal control officer who had clearly dealt with similar situations before. Officer Martinez approached the package with professional caution while I explained the recent family conflict that made me suspicious of anonymous deliveries. The animal control specialist, a woman named Dr. T. Sarah Chen, confirmed my worst fears after carefully examining the box structure and listening for sounds from inside. The breathing holes were precisely placed to provide adequate air circulation for a small reptile. The size and weight suggested something between 2 and 4 feet in length. The soft rustling sounds indicated the creature was awake and moving around in its confined space. Dr. Chen worked with methodical efficiency, using specialized equipment to safely extract what turned out to be a young diamondback rattlesnake native to the Arizona desert, but definitely not something that belonged in a suburban kitchen. The snake was alive, healthy, and according to Dr. Chen, worth several $100s from a legitimate reptile dealer. Officer Martinez took photographs of the packaging, the shipping label, and the snake itself, building documentation for what he clearly considered a criminal matter rather than a family prank. He explained that using venomous animals to intimidate or threaten someone constituted assault in Arizona law regardless of family relationships. While Dr. Chen secured the snake for transport to a wildlife facility, I found myself staring at the empty cardboard box, trying to process the level of planning that had gone into this Mother's Day gift. Someone had researched reptile suppliers purchased a venomous snake arranged for Sunday delivery and calculated the timing to ensure maximum psychological impact. The shipping label provided the first clue about the sender. Though no return address was visible, the tracking number led Officer Martinez to a shipping store in Tempe, about 20 minutes from Sophia's apartment. Security cameras would need to be reviewed, but the geographic proximity wasn't coincidental. I shared my suspicions about Sophia and Jake with Officer Martinez, explaining the recent financial conflict and Sophia's threats about making me regret my decision. He listened with the patient attention of someone who had seen family disputes escalate into criminal behavior before. The credit card charges I'd noticed weeks earlier suddenly made terrible sense. Reptile Palace, a specialty store that sold exotic pets to licensed dealers and experienced collectors. $275 charged to the emergency credit card that Sophia was supposed to use only for legitimate family needs. My daughter had used my own money to purchase a weapon designed to terrorize me on Mother's Day. Officer Martinez asked if I wanted to file formal charges once they confirmed the package's origin. I hesitated, still struggling with the maternal instinct to protect Sophia, even after she'd crossed such a fundamental line. That hesitation would prove to be a mistake I'd regret within hours. After the police and animal control left, I sat in my quiet kitchen, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter had sent me a rattlesnake, not a harmless garden snake or a rubber toy meant to startle me, but a venomous reptile capable of serious harm. The magnitude of Sophia's anger was far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. My hands shook as I dialed her number, needing to hear her voice, hoping, against logic, that there might be some explanation that didn't involve my only child deliberately trying to terrorize me on Mother's Day. Sophia answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that artificial brightness she used when she was hiding something. She asked about my Mother's Day morning with the fake enthusiasm of someone who already knew exactly how my morning had gone. I told her about receiving an unusual package, keeping my voice neutral while listening carefully to her response. She expressed appropriate surprise and concern, asking what kind of package would cause problems on a holiday morning. Her performance was convincing, but I'd spent 28 years detecting lies from teenagers who thought they were clever. The confirmation came when I heard Jake's unmistakable laughter in the background. Not the surprised reaction of someone hearing unexpected news, but the satisfied chuckle of someone enjoying a private joke. That sound removed any remaining doubt about who had orchestrated my morning's terror. I told Sophia about the rattlesnake, about the police response, about the investigation that would trace the package back to its sender. Her silence stretched long enough for me to hear her calculating what story might provide the best defense. When she finally responded, Sophia didn't deny involvement. Instead, she minimized it, calling the snake delivery a harmless prank designed to get my attention after I'd been so unreasonable about family financial assistance. According to her logic, sending a venomous reptile was simply creative communication from a daughter whose mother refused to listen to reasonable requests. Jake's voice joined the conversation, explaining that they'd researched thoroughly to ensure the snake wasn't actually dangerous to someone who remained calm and called professionals. They'd provided breathing holes in Sunday delivery to minimize the time the animal spent confined. In their minds, they'd been responsible and thoughtful in their choice of revenge tactics. I listened to them justify attempted intimidation with a deadly animal, marveling at their ability to reframe criminal behavior as family communication. Sophia actually seemed proud of the creativity involved in her Mother's Day surprise, as if terrorizing elderly parents required the kind of ingenuity that deserved recognition. The conversation ended with Sophia demanding that I drop any police investigation and restore her financial access immediately. She positioned the snake delivery as fair retaliation for my unreasonable behavior and suggested that future incidents might be necessary if I continued being stubborn about family obligations. After hanging up, I realized that Officer Martinez had been right about filing formal charges. Sophia and Jake weren't finished with their campaign to force my compliance with their financial demands. They were just getting started. Within 2 hours of our phone conversation, Sophia and Jake arrived at my house in a fury that made their previous visit look like a polite disagreement. I watched through my front window as they slammed car doors and stormed across my yard with the aggressive energy of people who felt wronged and intended to set things right through intimidation. This time, they didn't bring Miguel. This time, they weren't pretending to have a reasonable conversation about family financial support. Sophia's face was flushed red with rage, and Jake's expression carried a darkness that made me glad I'd already called Officer Martinez to report their confirmed involvement in the snake incident. They pounded on my front door with enough force to rattle the frame, shouting demands that I open up immediately and stop hiding behind police reports like a coward. When I didn't respond quickly enough, Jake's voice rose to threats about what happened to people who called law enforcement on their own family members. I opened the door, but didn't invite them inside, standing in my doorway, while they unleashed their fury about my betrayal of family loyalty. Sophia accused me of choosing strangers in uniforms over my own daughter's well-being, of escalating a harmless prank into a criminal investigation that could ruin their lives. Jake stepped closer, using his physical size to intimidate me in ways that would have terrified the woman I'd been just weeks earlier. He explained that families handle disputes privately, that involving police in personal matters showed weakness and disloyalty, that continuing the investigation would have consequences I wouldn't enjoy. Sophia joined his implicit threats with explicit ones, promising that I'd never see Miguel again if I didn't withdraw my police report immediately. She painted vivid pictures of my grandson, growing up without knowing his grandmother, of missing his childhood because I'd chosen pride over family reconciliation. But the threats that had once paralyzed me with fear now felt powerless against the clarity I'd gained since cutting off their financial support. I looked at my daughter and her unemployed boyfriend, demanding that I ignore their attempt to terrorize me with a venomous snake, and I saw them clearly for the first time in years. They weren't victims of my selfishness. They were adults who had never learned that actions have consequences because I'd spent 8 years protecting them from the results of their poor choices. The woman who sent rattlesnakes to her mother wasn't someone who deserved continued financial support or emotional accommodation. I told them the police investigation would continue, that any further contact would constitute harassment under Arizona law, and that their threats about Miguel only proved that they shouldn't have unsupervised access to an impressionable child who was learning their values about family relationships. Sophia's response was to promise that this was far from over, that they knew where I lived and worked, that they had friends who understood how to handle situations like this when families needed to stick together. After they left, I realized I needed legal protection that went far beyond a police report. The next morning, I called Carmen Rodriguez, the attorney who had handled my retirement planning and estate documents for the past decade. Carmen had guided me through the legal complexities of early retirement from the school district, and I trusted her judgment about family law matters that were becoming increasingly urgent. Her office occupied a renovated adobe building in downtown Phoenix, its walls lined with legal texts and certificates that spoke of 15 years protecting families like mine. I sat across from her desk with a folder of documentation, feeling calmer than I had since the snake delivery, but understanding that I needed comprehensive legal barriers between Sophia's desperation and my security. Carmen listened without interruption as I described the escalating pattern of financial manipulation, the threats involving Miguel the snake incident, and yesterday's intimidating visit to my home. She took notes methodically, her expression growing more serious with each detail I provided. When I finished, Carmen explained that my situation required protection on multiple fronts. A restraining order would establish legal boundaries that transformed any future contact into criminal matter rather than family dispute. Estate planning modifications would remove Sophia's incentive for continued harassment while protecting Miguel's future educational needs. She outlined the framework for a comprehensive response. The restraining order would prohibit Sophia and Jake from contacting me directly, coming to my home, or using Miguel as leverage in their attempts to restore financial access. Violations would result in immediate arrest rather than family negotiations. The estate modifications proved more complex, but ultimately more important. Carmen recommended establishing an educational trust fund that would provide for Miguel's schooling, college expenses, and legitimate educational needs, while preventing any access by his parents. Sophia would have no control over the funds, no ability to manipulate her son's inheritance, no leverage over his educational future. My house retirement accounts and personal security would remain fully protected through updated beneficiary designations that remove Sophia entirely. She would inherit nothing, control nothing, and have no legal standing to challenge decisions made for Miguel's benefit by professional trustees. The process would take approximately 1 week for the estate modifications and could be implemented immediately for the restraining order. Once both protections were in place, Sophia's anger would be directed at a legal system designed to handle such behavior, rather than at an elderly woman trying to enjoy her retirement. Carmen's assistant prepared the initial documentation while we discussed timeline and implementation. The restraining order could be filed that afternoon, with court officers serving Sophia and Jake by the following morning. After service, any attempt to contact me would become a police matter rather than a family problem. I signed the preliminary documents, feeling the satisfying finality of decisions made and implemented. 8 years of financial enabling was officially ending through legal channels that Sophia couldn't manipulate or circumvent through emotional appeals. Tomorrow morning, my daughter would discover that intimidation was no longer an option. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully, knowing that professional legal protection had replaced my failed attempts at family boundary setting. The law would give me back my life. 2 days later, Carmen called to confirm what I'd been anticipating with a mixture of relief and sadness. The legal documents had been delivered to both Sophia and Jake that morning, officially ending their access to my financial resources and establishing criminal penalties for any future harassment. I spent that afternoon in my garden, tending to the roses and desert plants that had been neglected during months of Sophia's manufactured crises. The physical work felt therapeutic, each weed pulled representing another boundary. Established, each flower watered, symbolizing my commitment to nurturing what was healthy in my life. The Arizona sun was setting behind the mountains when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up on the 4th ring. Sophia's voice exploded through the speaker with a fury that surpassed anything I'd heard during our previous confrontations. She had been served with legal papers at her apartment in front of neighbors, and Miguel humiliated by official documents that labeled her harassment and painted her as a danger to her own mother. According to Sophia, my decision to involve attorneys instead of handling family matters privately was the ultimate betrayal of everything she'd believed about our relationship. Jake's voice joined the conversation from the background, adding his threats about what happened to people who use legal systems against their own family members. He spoke about community loyalty, about consequences for calling lawyers instead of working things out between relatives, about how some problems couldn't be solved by hiding behind court orders. I listened to their rage with the detached calm of someone who had finally stopped enabling destructive behavior. Sophia's fury only confirmed that the legal protections were necessary. Adults who responded to boundaries with increased threats and intimidation weren't people who could be reasoned with through family conversations. Sophia demanded that I withdraw the restraining order immediately, restore her financial access, and apologize for the embarrassment I'd caused her in front of neighbors who now knew about her family problems. She positioned my legal protection as an attack on her dignity, rather than a response to her criminal behavior. When I refused, Sophia played her final card about Miguel. She promised that I would never see my grandson again, that he would grow up learning that his grandmother was a selfish woman who chose money over family love, that my legal protection would cost me the only relationship that had made her manipulation possible. But her threats felt powerless now. Carmen had explained that the Educational Trust Fund would ensure Miguel's needs were met regardless of his parents' poor choices. Someday, when he was old enough to understand, Miguel would learn that his grandmother had protected his future, even when his parents had tried to destroy it. The call ended with Sophia promising that legal papers wouldn't stop her from getting what her family deserved, that she knew people who understood how to handle situations when courts interfered with family business. After hanging up, I realized that Sophia still didn't understand that her harassment had lost all power over my decisions. Tomorrow would teach her otherwise. The following weeks brought the most profound peace I'd experienced since Sophia's financial problems had begun consuming my retirement years. For the first time in nearly a decade, my phone didn't ring with emergency demands for money. My bank account remained stable, earning interest for my own security, rather than being drained by manufactured crises that somehow always required immediate financial solutions. I established new routines that reflected the woman I'd been before becoming Sophia's personal rescue service. Morning walks through my neighborhood without constantly checking for missed calls. Afternoon reading sessions in my garden without anxiety about potential emergencies. Evening phone calls with friends whose conversations didn't revolve around my daughter's latest financial disaster. The restraining order had created exactly the protective barrier that Carmen had promised. Sophia's attempts to contact me through social media, email, and mutual acquaintances all constituted violations that were quickly addressed by law enforcement. She learned that legal consequences were immediate and non-negotiable, unlike the family boundaries she'd been manipulating for years. My house felt different now, lighter somehow. The tension that had permeated every room during months of anticipating Sophia's next crisis had been replaced by the comfortable quiet of a home that belonged to its owner, rather than serving as an emergency bank for irresponsible adults. I found myself thinking often about my parents who had immigrated to Arizona with nothing but determination and faith in education's power to transform lives. They had never asked relatives for money, never expected their parents to fund their poor choices, never weaponized their children against family members who refused financial support. Sophia had learned values that were completely opposite to everything my family had traditionally believed about personal responsibility and dignity. Somehow, in my efforts to give her opportunities I'd never had, I taught her that consequences were optional if you could manipulate the right people into solving your problems. The Educational Trust Fund that Carmen had established for Miguel represented my attempt to break that cycle. Miguel would have access to excellent schooling, college funding, and educational opportunities, but only through systems that couldn't be manipulated by his parents for other purposes. He would learn that education was valuable, that planning for the future mattered, that adults were expected to manage their own responsibilities. Sometimes I wondered if Sophia would eventually understand what she'd lost through her escalating demands and threats. Our relationship hadn't been destroyed by my refusal to fund Jake's gambling debts. It had been destroyed by her decision to respond to reasonable boundaries with criminal behavior and intimidation. I missed the daughter I'd raised, the bright child, who had helped me organize school events and asked thoughtful questions about the world. But that child had grown into an adult who sent venomous snakes to terrorize elderly parents who wouldn't provide unlimited financial support. The woman who had made those choices wasn't someone I needed to enable any longer. Legal protection had freed me from her manipulation while ensuring that Miguel's future remained secure despite his parents' poor judgment. For the first time in years, I was living my own life rather than managing Sophia's crises. 6 months after that Mother's Day morning, when I almost opened a package containing a rattlesnake, I sat in my kitchen with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and pink. The view hadn't changed, but my perspective on everything else had transformed completely. I thought about the mother I'd been for 31 years, the woman who believed that unconditional love meant unlimited financial support, that protecting my daughter from consequences was the same as protecting her from harm. I'd confused enabling with nurturing manipulation with need, and Sophia's increasing desperation with evidence that I wasn't giving enough. My years in education had taught me that troubled students needed clear boundaries more than they needed rescue from their poor choices. I'd applied that wisdom successfully to hundreds of other people's children while failing completely to implement it with my own daughter. Professional insight had been worthless against maternal guilt. The hardest realization was accepting that Sophia's problems weren't caused by my insufficient support, but by my excessive willingness to solve every crisis she created. By removing consequences from her choices, I'd taught her that manipulation was more effective than responsibility, that threats produced better results than honest work. Miguel appeared in my thoughts often during these quiet morning reflections. I wondered what he was learning from his parents about family relationships, about money management, about how adults handle disagreements. Would he grow up believing that love could be purchased with credit card payments, that elderly relatives existed to fund younger family members' poor choices? The educational trust fund Carmen had established would provide Miguel with opportunities his parents couldn't destroy, but it couldn't protect him from the values he was absorbing through daily exposure to Sophia and Jake's approach to problem solving. That knowledge brought both sadness and acceptance. I couldn't save Miguel from his parents' influence any more than I could have saved Sophia from her own choices. The best I could do was ensure that financial resources would be available for his education when he was old enough to make independent decisions about his future. Sometimes former colleagues would ask about Sophia and Miguel, and I found myself giving brief, neutral responses that revealed nothing about the family crisis that had reshaped my retirement. Most people assumed that grandmother-grandchild relationships naturally involved regular contact, and explaining the restraining order required more emotional energy than casual conversations warranted. But my close friends understood that families could become toxic despite shared DNA, that protecting yourself from harmful relatives was sometimes necessary for survival. Rosa, my neighbor, who had watched the police activity on Mother's Day morning, offered quiet support without requiring detailed explanations about what had led to such dramatic interventions. The shame I'd initially felt about having legal protection from my own daughter had gradually been replaced by pride in finally establishing appropriate boundaries. I'd stopped being a victim of Sophia's manipulation and become a woman who refused to enable destructive behavior, regardless of family connections. That transformation felt like the most important achievement of my entire adult life. 1 year after the snake incident, I received a call that reminded me why my story matters to other families facing similar struggles. A former teaching colleague named Patricia reached out because her adult son had been demanding money for increasingly questionable expenses, and she recognized patterns that felt familiar from conversations we'd had during my years of enabling Sophia. Patricia's situation wasn't identical to mine, but the underlying dynamics were disturbingly similar. An adult child who had learned that financial emergencies produced parental rescue. Escalating demands that grew bolder with each successful manipulation. Threats about limiting access to grandchildren when reasonable boundaries were suggested. I listened to Patricia describe the same emotional paralysis I'd experienced for years. The fear that saying no to unreasonable demands would somehow prove that she didn't love her son enough. She'd been funding his poor choices for so long that she'd forgotten what healthy family relationships looked like. Sharing my experience with Patricia felt like the first genuinely positive outcome of everything I'd endured with Sophia. My hard-won understanding of manipulation tactics could help another mother recognize that enabling destructive behavior wasn't actually loving, that protecting adult children from consequences prevented them from developing necessary life skills. Patricia asked the question I'd wrestled with for months. How do you know when helping family becomes harmful, enabling? The answer I'd learned through painful experience was surprisingly simple. Help builds independence, while enabling creates permanent dependency. Help is temporary and goal-oriented, while enabling becomes an endless cycle of crisis and rescue. I explained to Patricia what I wished someone had told me years earlier, that adult children who consistently require financial rescue aren't victims of bad luck, but people who haven't learned to manage their own responsibilities. That parents who continuously solve problems for capable adults are preventing growth rather than providing support. The most important insight I shared was about recognizing manipulation techniques. When financial requests come with emotional blackmail threats about relationship consequences or guilt about family obligations, those aren't legitimate requests for help. They're attempts to circumvent adult responsibility through psychological pressure. Patricia thanked me for the honest perspective she couldn't get from friends who hadn't experienced similar family manipulation. Many people assume that difficult adult children just need more understanding, more patience, more financial support to overcome their struggles. They don't realize that some family members become predatory when they discover that guilt and threats can produce financial results. After our conversation, I realized that my experience with Sophia had given me knowledge that could benefit other families trapped in similar cycles of enabling and manipulation. The legal protections, boundary setting techniques, and emotional strategies I'd developed weren't just personal solutions, but potentially helpful guidance for other parents facing similar challenges. Perhaps the most valuable lesson I could share was that loving your adult children sometimes means refusing to rescue them from problems they created. That protecting your own financial security isn't selfish, but necessary. That family relationships require mutual respect, and adults who use intimidation tactics to control elderly relatives aren't behaving like family members who deserve unlimited support. Real love sometimes requires saying no. As I finish telling you this story, I'm sitting in the same kitchen where I once stood, frozen with fear, staring at a package that contained my daughter's attempt to terrorize me into financial compliance. That terrified woman feels like someone I used to know rather than someone I used to be. Today marks 18 months since I received that Mother's Day snake delivery, and I can honestly say that every difficult decision I made in response to Sophia's escalating manipulation has proven correct. The legal protections Carmen established have held firm. The financial boundaries I created have remained intact. The peace I found by refusing to enable destructive behavior has only deepened with time. Sophia attempted to violate the restraining order twice during the first year, both times resulting in brief jail sentences that finally taught her that legal consequences were immediate and non-negotiable. She eventually stopped trying to contact me directly, though I occasionally hear through mutual acquaintances that she and Jake continue struggling with financial problems that somehow never motivate them to seek steady employment. Miguel is now 9 years old, and while I haven't seen him since that day when Sophia brought him to my house to witness her tantrum, I receive updates about his progress through the Educational Trust Fund administrators. He's doing well in school, showing the same curiosity and intelligence that Sophia had displayed at his age. The fund has already covered specialized tutoring, educational supplies, and enrichment programs that his parents couldn't have afforded. Someday, when Miguel is old enough to understand complex family dynamics, he may choose to contact me independently. If that happens, I'll be ready to explain why his grandmother chose to protect his educational future rather than continue funding his parents' irresponsible choices. Until then, I'm content knowing that his opportunities remain secure, regardless of Sophia and Jake's poor financial management. The woman I've become through this experience is stronger, clearer, and more authentic than the person who spent 8 years being manipulated through maternal guilt. I've learned that protecting yourself from harmful family members isn't betrayal, but necessary self-preservation. That love without boundaries becomes enabling. That adults who use threats and intimidation to control elderly relatives aren't behaving like family members who deserve unlimited support. My story isn't unique. Across America, elderly parents are being financially manipulated by adult children who have learned that guilt threats and emotional blackmail can be more profitable than honest work. Grandparents are being denied access to grandchildren by adult children who use those relationships as leverage for extracting money. Retirement savings are being drained to fund gambling addictions, shopping sprees, and lifestyle choices that responsible adults would finance through their own employment. If my experience sounds familiar, if you recognize patterns of financial manipulation in your own family relationships, please know that you're not alone and you're not powerless. Legal protections exist for exactly these situations. Attorneys who specialize in elder law understand family dynamics that involve financial abuse. Restraining orders can establish boundaries that family conversations cannot. The hardest part of protecting yourself from manipulative family members is overcoming the guilt that suggests you're abandoning people who need help. But adults who consistently require financial rescue while showing no gratitude, no effort to change, and no respect for your boundaries aren't people who need help. They're people who have learned to use family connections for financial exploitation. You deserve to enjoy your retirement years without constantly managing other people's self-created crises. Your savings belong to you, not to adult children who refuse to manage their own responsibilities. Your home should be a sanctuary, not a place where you feel threatened or intimidated by family members demanding money. Breaking cycles of financial manipulation requires courage, legal support, and the understanding that real love sometimes means refusing to enable destructive behavior. It's never too late to establish boundaries. Seek legal protection and reclaim control of your own financial security. If this story has resonated with your own family experiences, Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content about family relationships and personal boundaries. Share your own thoughts about difficult family dynamics in the comments below and let us know where you're listening from today. Remember, protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Thank you for listening to my story.